G'day guys, welcome back to the workshop. So today we're going to be discussing how to create flatness with machinery. Now, I don't have a mill, I don't have a surface grinder. Those two items will help you with flatness, obviously. But we're going to talk about what you might have as a knife maker, or even as maybe a blacksmith, is a 2x72 grinder, and maybe one other tool. You can have it in the same tool though, I'll show you that in a second. But with that being said, if you haven't already watched my video on how to create flatness by hand, I am going to be shooting over a couple of the points here because many of them are similar. So if you want to go ahead and hit the link up there to see that, then that'll give you the hints on the hand finishing portion of this. Mostly I'm going to be focusing on the machine. Okay, so here we have a 2x72 grinder, very similar in form to a lot of the grinders you can find on the market, whether it be the Shopmaster or the KMG or the Wilmot Tag. This specific model is the Fire Ant from Five Hands Fabrication. He no longer makes this, he makes the Scorpion grinder, which has basically similar features. It's just an upright grinder rather than the four-wheel. But yeah, this is my favorite grinder at the moment, and it has a couple of attachments that make making things flat a lot easier. But the first thing to note is a flat platen, as is called on a grinder, is not flat. It's almost never flat, even if you take it off a surface grinder, even if you take it to a mill, even if you hand lap that thing perfectly flat. When you are grinding, and we're going to be using these blocks that we used from the hand finishing video, when you're grinding, you're going to introduce some form of convexity or concavity to the piece, and there's a reason for that, and I'll show you that in a second. But flat platen grinders never make things actually flat, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second machine tool that we're going to be using is actually part of the same tool, which is a disc grinder. Now, you can have a disc grinder that is separate to the machine, and I would highly advise that, because the disadvantage to this one is that it's not reversible. It only runs in one direction. If you have one that's reversible, that's a lot better. And also VFD driven, so variable speed is incredibly useful. This one is variable speed because it's hooked up to my VFD driven grinder. The Scorpion also has that ability. But yeah, disc grinder is going to be massively important. And this is a dead flat. So this one has been machined to be true flat on a lathe. There are custom grinder makers out there that make disc sanders for this kind of purpose. And I believe 2x72grinders.com is one that sells them over in the US. But yeah, definitely this is the next level for flattening if you don't want a mill, or if you don't have the room for a mill or the money for a mill or surface grinder. But let's get closer to this platen and I'll show you why it's not flat. Okay, so here we are at the flat platen, and what you'll see is that the belt isn't, adhered to it. It's got some movement, and it's suspended between the two wheels. Now, I push my platen out so that it's in nice contact with the platen. The platen is in contact from top to bottom, all the way up. But what you'll notice is that the edges are relatively in contact, right? I can't move it, but as you move to the center, you see how it moves a little bit. So what happens is that when you grind, as you touch the piece to the surface, it actually grinds the center before it starts grinding the edges. And on most grinder belts, especially used ones, this one's a fairly fresh one, but even then you can see that the grit on the edges is actually less touched than the grit on the middle, and that's because if you're grinding from side to side like this, or side to side like that, you're always in contact with the central piece. So after a while, especially on worn out belts, you end up with a concave surface that kind of cups like this, and you will create that concavity or your convexity on your work. The other thing is that when you're holding against the platen, a lot of the time there will be slight dishing in this direction, because as you use the grinder, the back of the belt is wearing away at the platen. Now, a fresh platen is obviously not going to have as much of an issue, but again, that bowing of the belt, and the higher the belt tension, the less this happens. But that bowing of the belt, as you're grinding, it's actually bunching up behind the work and then stretching out behind it. So it's bunching up as it hits the work and then pulling through. And it's being pulled by the drive wheel behind it. So there's always going to be a slight radius to this top edge that you're not going to notice by eye, but it's definitely there. So we've got these flat surfaces that we created on these from the grinding, from the hand lapping. I'm going to take these to the grinder very quickly, and I'll show you how they're not flat. So there we go, both ground, and it's a rough grit, but I can already tell that they rock together. It's not going to be super obvious, but they're not, they're no longer perfectly aligned. Hopefully you can see that rocking. Right, that wouldn't happen if they were flat, even at this higher grit. And there's nothing between them, so yeah. But because of that slight belt convexity, they're not actually flat. So now we're going to move to the disc grinder, and I'll show you how that helps get us flat. Okay, so here we are at the disc grinder, and I'm going to attach some 400 grit sandpaper. Now, coming from a 60 grit belt finish, you probably wouldn't start with 400, but I want to demonstrate to you how different the flatness is in the two pieces. Normally you would start with something like 120 or 240 at maximum, and then you would step up the grits. Now, when attaching any kind of abrasive to your disc platen, make sure that the disc is clean. This little streaking here is actually degreaser that I used just before the video, so that's not going to cause a problem. And again, we're going to be using our old friend spray adhesive, but we don't want to spray the wheel. Main reason is I don't want to put spray adhesive all over my machine and end up damaging the internals of the motor or gumming up the bearings or anything like that. So what I'm going to do, just turn the camera here, is I'm going to spray the sheet down instead. Nice even coat. Doesn't matter if I get some on my hands because I can always clean that up. Now obviously the whole sheet's not going to fit on the wheel, but with a nice even coat over the whole surface, I can guarantee that adhesive will be touching every part of the wheel, so I won't have any of the paper coming off. Now I've just got to let this dry for for about a minute before it'll be tacky enough that I can attach it to the wheel, and we'll come back. Okay, so that's adhered and I've pressed it on, and now all I'm going to do is run a knife around the rim of the wheel. Sacrificial knife. Obviously I don't want to dig into the wheel, but I'm going to take off all of the paper I can. And if you push into the wheel, it just helps you cut. So obviously the paper is going to damage the edge, and that's why you want a relatively rough knife or a cheap one. This is my shop knife, which I made in the 1 hour knife challenge a while back, if those of you remember that. But now we have a disc grinder with 400 grit disc on it. And what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the speed right down to the slowest setting. And you can lubricate these. I'm not going to bother today, but you can use a little bit of, you could use a little bit of WD-40 or Windex. Just be aware that WD-40 may break down the adhesive that's holding the sandpaper onto the disc. And like with using any spinning machinery, we're going to work in the bottom third, and we're going to work on the side that's towards us. If we work here and in the top third, it's likely to shoot this way. If we use it here, it's likely to shoot downwards. So we're running nice and slow, so it's not going to really cause an issue. But hopefully you'll be able to see. I might actually have to mark this out, but all of the edges haven't been touched by abrasive. Let's see if I can bring it closer and show you in the light. Yeah, there you go. You can see how all of the edges are untouched by the 400 grit abrasive. So it's closer to flat than I got it with the file, but it's still not flat. So you're just going to go at this a bit more with the disc. And you can see the good sharp belt, on your flat platen, and a fresh belt, tends to make the flatness at it better. Now, when you're flattening a piece, something that helps, something that you need to remember is that due to the law of physics, the inside will be moving slower than the outside. So say I had something that was perfectly flat, right, that I was trying to thin on this side, but keep this side slightly thicker. If I really wanted to do that, then all I would have to do is hold the end that I wanted to keep thicker on the inside and keep the end that I wanted to remove more material from on the outside. And what that would do is that the higher speed on the outside of the disc is going to remove more material. And so this way, I end up with a flat piece that I am slightly tapering due to the higher speed on the outside of the disc. Now, something very useful in disc sanders that you can also use in belt grinders and stuff like that, especially when working with wood. It doesn't work as well with steel, but a clearing stick, one of these rubber clearing sticks, works really well to clear that grit from your Now you hear that bumpy bump? That is a buildup of either the rubber or, more likely in this case, the adhesive behind the wheel, because I may have accidentally put a little too much in. Right, now, one thing to note, I've kind of switched the sides around a few times trying to get it good and flat. One thing you'll notice is that there's always going to be slight variations in the flatness when you use the disc. Now, these variations are actually infinitesimal, but they are there. And the reason for it is because your hands aren't perfectly rigid when they go into contact with the disc. And so things tend to flutter a little bit and tend to create rolls and ridges and all that kinds of stuff, and you'll never get it truly flat using the disc. But this is now so flat that we can take it to the hand lap, which I showed you in the first video, and it'll only take a few seconds to get it perfectly flat. So I'll show you that now. Off camera, I took the other piece and I took it to the disc grinder so that they're now both disc ground flat. And they should be, at this stage, disc ground flat enough that they will stick together with a little bit of moisture. So they are nominally perfectly flat. Like from here, you could take this and work with it, no problem. But you can see they don't stick together too well with limited moisture. And that's because the moisture creates a gasket. So what we're going to do is we're going to moisten the, lubricate the sandpaper. And again, we're just going to take those little figure of eights, and I'm barely pressing down. I'm just letting the weight of the piece do the work. With a slightly lighter piece, you might want to put a little bit more kind of muscle behind it. You can see that we're starting to create an even all over scratch pattern. And this is evening out and flattening out any of those little eccentricities that the disc grinder implemented. So that's now covered in a 400 grit hand lap. Moved some fresh grit. Rotate the piece in my hand, because as I'm doing this with my outstretched arm, I can kind of impart some rocking motions. If I do it in a circle, I need to reverse it, do figure of eights. I can do push-pull, but again, I don't want to rock the piece. Okay. And that should be mostly flat. So now when I moisten them, just a drop, maybe two. Now, you can see they do stick together quite a bit better than otherwise. I'm not actually holding them together with my thumbs, I was just stopping it from sliding sideways. You can see my... But if I turn my hand sideways, it slides off. So, there you go. Much faster with machinery, but just as effective a finish by hand. One more note about the disc grinder. Now that I've finished with it, you can see that the glue didn't hold too well, but that doesn't matter because centripetal force will hold it in place. I can simply peel it off. Again, we've got that repositionable glue. This stuff will be slightly tacky, and I could re-stick to this with sandpaper, but I don't want to. So all I'm going to do is take some acetone. This is just store-bought acetone, the usual, and clean it up. Using an old cloth, so it's got a lot of detritus, but that's going to be perfectly clean. There's a little stubborn bit ready for the next grit. It doesn't have to be a massive laborious effort. If you have to go through scrubbing this down in order to get all the glue off, then either you're using the wrong glue or you're using the wrong solvent. There you go, ready for use. So, there you have it. It's just another way to create flatness in your workshop. This is a lot faster, and this is why knife makers invest in things like belt grinders, like disc sanders. And honestly, for a small shop or a professional shop, a disc grinder is a must-have. Creating flatness is easy with a mill or with a surface grinder, but those can be upwards of $2,500, $3,000, $5,000 depending on the size. And not all of them are going to be as reliable as a good old disc sander. The other thing is that disc sanders are incredibly useful for doing large flat surfaces like knife tangs, like knife bevels, all kinds of stuff that we normally deal with on a day-to-day basis that we need to make flat. You can also back your disc sander disc with a thin piece of rubber, and it makes a really good finishing disc for pre-hand sanding. For blades and stuff like that, it makes it a lot easier to get to a higher grit because you can machine sand all the way up to 3,000 grit if you want to, if you're dedicated enough. But yeah, so if you're looking at the next investment after a belt grinder, then I would highly suggest a disc sander. Now, these techniques can be used with a number of different tools. Now, files and stuff like that, like I showed in the last video, you could use an angle grinder. Use an angle grinder to get your rough shape, then file to flush, and then hand lap to flat. The same thing with the belt grinder. You can, hog it off with the angle grinder, go to the belt grinder, and then go to the disc sander if you have one. If you don't have a disc sander, you saw how relatively flat it came off the belt. It wouldn't take too much after finishing at about a 240 grit belt finish to take it to a 400 grit hand lapped flat. Just as fast as it took me to get it from a smooth file finish in the last piece. It might even be faster because the belt's going to be more flat than my rocking file motion. So just get out there, try things out, try new things. Remember that if you need a flat surface for your surface plate, if you don't have access to a proper surface plate, a piece of tabletop, a marble tabletop, granite tabletop, or a piece of float glass will be close to flat enough for most of what we do. We're not talking, nanometers flat, but as flat as you will need it for most of your projects. So get out there, make some stuff flat, have fun, and I'll see you in the next video.